Prince Alexander walked through the grand halls of Valdoria Castle with heavy steps. At 15 years old, he carried himself with the dignity expected of future royalty, but today felt different. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across marble floors that had been polished to perfection by countless servants over the centuries. The young prince had always felt something missing in his life. While other royal children spoke fondly of their mothers, Alexander had only vague memories of Queen Isabella. She had died when he was just 5 years old, and his father, King Marcus, rarely spoke of her. The official story was simple: the queen had fallen ill with a mysterious disease that claimed her life despite the best efforts of royal physicians. Alexander paused before a massive portrait hanging in the corridor. Queen Isabella's painted eyes seemed to follow him, her gentle smile frozen in time. She wore a stunning sapphire necklace in the portrait, one he had never seen in the royal treasury. The young prince had always wondered about that necklace, but whenever he asked about it, his father would change the subject or claim he didn't remember such details. "Your Highness," came a voice from behind him. Alexander turned to see Lord Reginald, his father's most trusted advisor, approaching with measured steps. The elderly man had served the crown for over 40 years and was one of the few people who had known Queen Isabella personally. "Lord Reginald," Alexander acknowledged with a slight nod. "I was just looking at my mother's portrait again." The old advisor's expression softened slightly. "She was a remarkable woman, Your Highness. Beautiful, intelligent, and deeply loved by the people." "Then, why does no one ever speak of her?" Alexander asked, his voice carrying a hint of frustration that he usually kept hidden. "It's as if she simply vanished from everyone's memory except for this painting." Lord Reginald shifted uncomfortably. "Grief affects people differently, Your Highness. Your father loved your mother very much. Perhaps speaking of her brings too much pain." Alexander studied the old man's face carefully. He had learned to read people's expressions from years of royal training, and something in Lord Reginald's eyes suggested there was more to the story. "What happened to her jewelry, Lord Reginald? The sapphire necklace she's wearing in this portrait?" I'm not certain, Your Highness. Such matters would be handled by the royal treasury." But Alexander caught the slight hesitation in his voice, the way his eyes briefly looked away. These were tells he had learned to recognize during diplomatic training. Lord Reginald was hiding something. That evening, Alexander sat in his private chambers, unable to concentrate on his studies. His tutor had assigned him reading about the kingdom's trade agreements with neighboring nations, but his mind kept wandering back to his mother's portrait and the mysterious necklace. He closed his books and walked to his window, looking out over the castle grounds. The gardens below were his mother's creation. Even 10 years after her death, the gardeners maintained them exactly as she had designed them. Roses bloomed in perfect patterns, and small fountains created peaceful sounds that could be heard even from his third-floor window. Alexander often found comfort in these gardens, feeling somehow closer to the mother he barely remembered. A soft knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called. To his surprise, his father entered the room. King Marcus was a tall, imposing man with graying hair and kind but tired eyes. Despite his royal duties keeping him busy, he always made time for his son. "You missed dinner tonight," the king said, settling into a chair across from Alexander's desk. "Cook mentioned you didn't eat much at lunch either." Alexander turned from the window to face his father. "I wasn't very hungry. Is something troubling you, son?" For a moment, Alexander considered asking his father directly about his mother's necklace, about the secrets that seemed to surround her memory. But something in his father's expression stopped him. The king looked older lately, more burdened by responsibilities. Alexander didn't want to add to that burden with questions that might cause pain. "Just thinking about my upcoming duties," Alexander said instead. "Lord Reginald has been preparing me for the trade negotiations next month." King Marcus smiled proudly. "You'll do wonderfully. Your mother would have been so proud to see the young man you've become." This was one of the rare occasions his father mentioned Queen Isabella directly. Alexander seized the opportunity. "I wish I remembered more about her." "You were very young when she passed," the king said softly. "But you have her eyes, and her kind heart. Sometimes when I look at you, it's like seeing her again." "What was she like?" "Really like, I mean. Not just the official stories everyone tells." King Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. She was complicated. Beautiful and intelligent, yes, but also strong-willed and independent. She didn't always agree with royal protocols. She believed in doing what was right, even when it was difficult. Did that cause problems? Sometimes, the king admitted. She made enemies among some of the noble families because she refused to play political games. She believed in honesty and justice above all else. Alexander felt a spark of curiosity. This was more about his mother than his father had ever shared. What kind of enemies? But the king seemed to catch himself, as if realizing he was saying too much. That's all in the past now, Alexander. What matters is that she loved you more than anything in this world, and she would want you to focus on your future, not on old troubles. After his father left, Alexander lay in bed staring at the ceiling. His father's words had raised more questions than they answered. What enemies had his mother made? What kind of political games had she refused to play? And why did everyone seem so reluctant to discuss the details of her life? The next morning brought Alexander's weekly sword training with Sir Thomas, the castle's master of arms. Sir Thomas was a gruff but fair man who had trained 3 generations of royal children. He was one of the few people who spoke to Alexander without the formal deference that others showed. Your form is improving, Sir Thomas said as they finished their session. But your mind isn't focused today. In real combat, that would get you killed. Alexander lowered his practice sword. Sir Thomas, you were here when my mother was alive, weren't you? The older man's expression became guarded. I was. What was she really like? Everyone gives me the same careful answers, but I want to know the truth. Sir Thomas studied Alexander's face for a long moment. Why this sudden interest in the past? It's not sudden, Alexander replied. I've always wondered. But, lately, I feel like everyone is hiding something from me. Like there's some secret about my mother that I'm not supposed to know. Sir Thomas set down his sword and wiped sweat from his forehead with a cloth. Your mother was a good woman, Prince Alexander. But she lived in complicated times. Sometimes good people get caught up in situations beyond their control. What kind of situations? The kind that are better left buried with the dead, Sir Thomas said firmly. Your father has his reasons for not speaking of certain things. Perhaps you should trust his judgment. But Alexander was growing tired of cryptic warnings and half-answers. I'm not a child anymore, Sir Thomas. I'm going to be king someday. Don't I have a right to know the truth about my own family? Sir Thomas's expression softened slightly. Perhaps you do. But the truth isn't always what we expect it to be. Sometimes it's better to let sleeping dogs lie. That afternoon, Alexander decided to explore parts of the castle he rarely visited. If everyone was determined to keep secrets about his mother, perhaps he could uncover some answers on his own. He made his way to the east wing, where several rooms had been sealed off since his mother's death. The hallway was dusty and dimly lit, clearly not part of the regular cleaning schedule. Alexander tried several doors, but most were locked. Finally, he found one that opened into what appeared to be a small sitting room. Furniture was covered with white sheets, and cobwebs stretched across corners. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through grimy windows, Alexander realized this had been his mother's private study. A desk sat near the window, and bookshelves lined the walls. Everything was covered in dust, as if the room had been abandoned the day she died. Alexander pulled the sheet off the desk and found it exactly as his mother had apparently left it. An inkwell sat next to a quill pen, and several books lay open. One appeared to be a journal with entries written in his mother's elegant handwriting. His heart racing, Alexander opened the journal to the last entry. The date showed it had been written just 2 days before his mother's death. Marcus grows more distant each day, the entry read. I fear my investigations have put our family in danger. Lord Blackwood's threats are becoming more direct. He knows I have evidence of his treasonous activities, and he's made it clear that he will stop at nothing to protect himself. I've hidden the proof where only Alexander will think to look when he's old enough to understand. If something happens to me, I pray he will find the truth and restore honor to our kingdom. Alexander's hands trembled as he read the words. His mother hadn't died of a mysterious illness. She had been investigating treason, and someone had threatened her. Lord Blackwood, he knew that name. Blackwood was one of the most powerful noble families in the kingdom, with vast holdings and political influence. He flipped through more pages, finding references to secret meetings, falsified documents, and money being stolen from the royal treasury. His mother had apparently been conducting her own investigation into corruption among the noble families. Another entry caught his attention: the sapphire necklace contains more than just precious stones. I've had a secret compartment built into it, containing copies of all the evidence I've gathered. If anything happens to me, Alexander must find it. I've arranged for it to be hidden in a place where only he would think to look, the place where we used to play together when he was small. Alexander's mind raced. Where had he played with his mother when he was small? He had so few clear memories from that time. But, slowly, an image formed in his mind. The gardens. There was a small gazebo in the far corner of the gardens where his mother used to take him to feed the ducks in a nearby pond. She would tell him stories there, and they would have picnics on summer afternoons. As Alexander prepared to leave the study, he heard footsteps in the hallway outside. Quickly, he closed the journal and slipped it inside his jacket. He managed to replace the sheet over the desk just as Lord Reginald appeared in the doorway. "Your Highness," the old advisor exclaimed, looking startled. "What are you doing here?" "These rooms are sealed for a reason." "I was just exploring," Alexander said, trying to keep his voice casual. "I wanted to see my mother's old rooms." Lord Reginald's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked around the study. "This area isn't safe, Your Highness. The floors could be unstable, and there could be hazards. You shouldn't be here without proper escort." Of course, Alexander agreed, moving toward the door. "I was just leaving." But, as he passed Lord Reginald, he caught the man looking carefully at the desk, as if checking to see if anything had been disturbed. Alexander's suspicions grew stronger. Lord Reginald knew more about his mother's death than he was revealing. That evening, Alexander waited until the castle was quiet before making his way to the gardens. The moon was full, providing enough light for him to navigate the familiar paths without a torch that might alert the guards. The gazebo stood exactly as he remembered it, though smaller than it had seemed to his 5-year-old eyes. Vines had grown over much of the structure, and the wooden benches showed signs of weather damage. Alexander searched every inch of the small building but found nothing obvious. Then, he remembered his mother's words about a place where only he would think to look. As a child, he had been fascinated by a loose stone in the gazebo's foundation. He used to hide small treasures there: pretty rocks, interesting leaves, toy soldiers. His mother had always pretended not to notice when he carefully replaced the stone. Alexander knelt down and felt along the foundation until he found the familiar loose stone. It moved easily, revealing a small cavity behind it. His heart pounded as his fingers touched something smooth and hard inside the hiding place. He pulled out a small wooden box, ornately carved and sealed with wax. Inside the box, wrapped in silk, was the sapphire necklace from his mother's portrait. It was even more beautiful in person, the deep blue stone seeming to capture moonlight and hold it. Alexander examined the necklace carefully and found what his mother's journal had described: a tiny hidden clasp that opened a secret compartment in the central pendant. Inside were several small pieces of paper, folded tightly and covered in his mother's careful handwriting. As he read the documents by moonlight, Alexander's understanding of his family's history changed completely. The papers contained evidence of a conspiracy involving several noble families, led by Lord Blackwood, to embezzle money from the royal treasury and sell military secrets to enemy kingdoms. But the most shocking revelation was in the final document. His mother had discovered that the conspiracy reached even higher than the noble families. Someone in the royal court itself was involved, someone with access to the king's private communications and state secrets. The evidence pointed to someone his mother had trusted, someone who would have had the opportunity to poison her when she got too close to the truth. Alexander's blood ran cold as he read the name his mother had written in her final note: "I believe Lord Reginald is the traitor within our own walls." Alexander sat in the moonlit gazebo, holding the evidence that would change everything he thought he knew about his mother's death and the people he trusted. The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. He was no longer just a prince learning to rule. He was the keeper of dangerous secrets, and the only person who could bring justice for his mother's murder. The young prince carefully returned the documents to their hiding place within the necklace and clasped it around his neck, hidden beneath his shirt. Tomorrow, he would have to decide what to do with this terrible knowledge. But tonight, he finally understood why his mother had died, and he knew that her death had not been in vain if he could find the courage to continue what she had started. As he made his way back to the castle, Alexander noticed a figure watching him from an upper window. The silhouette disappeared quickly, but not before he recognized the familiar outline. Lord Reginald had seen him in the gardens, and Alexander realized that his quest for truth had just become much more dangerous. Alexander barely slept that night. Every creak of the old castle walls made him jump, and every shadow seemed to hide potential danger. The sapphire necklace lay hidden beneath his mattress, but its weight felt like it was pressing down on his chest even from its hiding place. When morning came, Alexander tried to act normally during breakfast with his father, but his mind kept racing with questions. How could he tell King Marcus that his most trusted advisor might have murdered the queen? How could he prove such a serious accusation without putting himself in danger? "You look tired, son," King Marcus observed, setting down his cup of tea. "Did you sleep poorly?" "Just some strange dreams," Alexander replied, which was partly true. The few moments he had managed to sleep had been filled with nightmares about his mother calling for help while shadowy figures pursued her through dark corridors. Lord Reginald entered the dining hall just then, and Alexander felt his stomach tighten. The old advisor's eyes met his briefly, and Alexander thought he detected something cold and calculating in that gaze. "Good morning, Your Majesty, Your Highness," Lord Reginald said with his usual respectful bow. "Your Majesty, the morning reports from the border provinces have arrived. There are some matters that require your immediate attention." King Marcus sighed and stood up from the table. "Duty calls, as always. Alexander, we'll continue our discussion about the trade negotiations later today." As his father left with Lord Reginald, Alexander caught the advisor glancing back at him once more. There was definitely something different about the man's behavior. The friendly warmth that had always characterized their interactions was gone, replaced by a watchful wariness. Alexander decided he needed to learn more before taking any action. If his mother had been investigating corruption, she might have kept additional evidence somewhere else in the castle. He spent the morning exploring areas he had never bothered to visit before, looking for any clue about where she might have hidden more information. In the castle's library, Alexander searched through his mother's favorite books, hoping she might have hidden notes between the pages. Most yielded nothing, but, in a volume of poetry she had apparently loved, he found a small piece of paper with what appeared to be a map of the castle. Several locations were marked with tiny symbols that he didn't recognize. One of the marked locations was the study where he had found her journal. Another was in the castle's bell tower, which had been abandoned for years after the old bell cracked. A third mark indicated somewhere in the wine cellars beneath the castle. Alexander decided to investigate the bell tower first, since it was the least likely place for him to encounter other people. He made his way up the narrow, winding stairs that led to the top of the tower. The air grew colder and dustier as he climbed, and spider webs caught in his hair. The bell tower hadn't been used in over a decade. The massive bronze bell hung silent and motionless, and bird droppings covered most surfaces. But, as Alexander searched the small room, he found what his mother's map had indicated: another loose stone, this one in the wall near the window. Behind the stone was a larger hiding place containing a leather portfolio filled with documents. Alexander's hands shook as he opened it and began reading. These papers contained detailed financial records showing exactly how money was being stolen from the royal treasury. The amounts were staggering enough to fund a small army. But, more disturbing were the letters between the conspirators. Alexander recognized several names of noble families who had always seemed loyal to the crown. The correspondence showed they were planning something much bigger than simple theft. They intended to weaken the kingdom financially and, then, stage a coup to remove King Marcus from power. One letter from Lord Blackwood was particularly chilling: "The Queen is becoming too dangerous. She has evidence that could destroy us all. Lord Reginald assures me he can handle the situation quietly. A sudden illness will raise fewer questions than an accident." Alexander felt sick as he read those words. His mother had been murdered, and Lord Reginald had been the one to do it. The man who had helped raise him, who had taught him about honor and duty, was a traitor and a killer. As Alexander carefully returned the documents to their hiding place, he heard footsteps on the stairs below. Someone was climbing to the bell tower. He quickly replaced the loose stone and looked around for somewhere to hide. The old bell provided the only cover in the small room. Alexander squeezed behind it just as Lord Reginald appeared at the top of the stairs. The advisor was breathing heavily from the climb, and his usually neat appearance was disheveled. Lord Reginald went straight to the wall where Alexander had just been searching. The old man ran his hands over the stones, checking to make sure nothing had been disturbed. Alexander held his breath, praying that he had replaced everything exactly as he had found it. "I know you're up here somewhere, boy," Lord Reginald said quietly, his voice completely different from the kindly tone Alexander had always known. Now it was cold and threatening. "You've been asking too many questions, going places you shouldn't go. Just like your mother." Alexander's heart pounded so loudly he was afraid Lord Reginald would hear it. He pressed himself further back behind the bell, trying to make himself as small as possible. "Your mother thought she was so clever," Lord Reginald continued, still examining the walls. "She thought she could uncover our plans and play the hero. She never understood that some things are bigger than individual conscience. The kingdom needs strong leadership, not the weakness your father represents." Lord Reginald turned toward the bell, and, for a terrible moment, Alexander thought he had been discovered. But the advisor seemed to be talking to himself more than looking for anyone. "Lord Blackwood grows impatient," the man muttered. "The plan should have been completed years ago, but the boy's questions are stirring up old concerns. Perhaps it's time to arrange another tragic accident. History could repeat itself so easily." The implied threat was clear. Lord Reginald was considering killing Alexander just as he had killed Queen Isabella. Alexander waited in terror until he heard the advisor's footsteps retreating down the stairs. When he was sure Lord Reginald was gone, Alexander emerged from his hiding place on shaking legs. He now had confirmation of everything his mother had discovered, but he also knew that his own life was in immediate danger. He needed help, but who could he trust? Alexander made his way carefully back to his chambers, checking around every corner to make sure he wasn't being followed. Once safely in his room, he tried to think through his options rationally. He could go to his father directly, but would King Marcus believe such serious accusations against his oldest friend? And if Lord Reginald realized he had been exposed, would he try to harm the king as well? The young prince needed an ally, someone with influence who wasn't part of the conspiracy. He thought about Sir Thomas, the Master of Arms. The gruff old soldier had always been honest with him, even when that honesty was uncomfortable. And Sir Thomas commanded the loyalty of the castle guard. If anyone could protect Alexander and his father, it would be him. That afternoon, Alexander found Sir Thomas in the training yard, working with a group of young guards on their swordwork. The Master of Arms noticed Alexander's tense expression immediately. "You look like you've seen a ghost, lad," Sir Thomas said after dismissing the trainees. "What's troubling you?" Alexander looked around to make sure they were alone, then made a decision that would change everything. "Sir Thomas, I need to tell you something important, but first I need to know, do you trust Lord Reginald completely?" The old soldier's eyes narrowed. "That's an odd question. Why do you ask? Please, just answer me. Do you trust him?" Sir Thomas was quiet for a long moment, studying Alexander's face. "I've always had my reservations about that one," he said finally. "He's too smooth, too careful with his words. A good soldier learns to trust his instincts about people, and mine have never been comfortable around Lord Reginald." "Why?" Alexander took a deep breath and made his choice. "Because I have evidence that he murdered my mother." Sir Thomas's expression went from curious to deadly serious in an instant. "That's a grave accusation, Prince Alexander. You'd better have solid proof before making such a claim." Alexander told Sir Thomas everything, finding his mother's journal, discovering the necklace and its hidden documents, overhearing Lord Reginald's confession in the bell tower. As he spoke, he watched the Master of Arms' face grow darker and more angry. "Your mother was a good woman," Sir Thomas said when Alexander finished. "I always suspected her death wasn't natural. She was too healthy, too strong to just suddenly fall ill. But I had no proof, and who would listen to a soldier's suspicions against the word of court physicians?" "Will you help me?" Alexander asked. "I can't do this alone, and I don't know who else to trust." Sir Thomas nodded grimly. I'll help you. But we need to be very careful about how we proceed. Lord Reginald has had years to establish himself in a position of power. He won't go down easily, and he's already shown he's willing to kill to protect his secrets." They spent the next hour planning their approach. Sir Thomas would quietly gather evidence about the financial irregularities, using his connections with the guards who handled security for the royal treasury. Meanwhile, Alexander would continue to act normally while secretly documenting everything he had discovered. "We'll need to move quickly," Sir Thomas warned. "If Lord Reginald suspects you know the truth, he might take drastic action. A convenient accident could be arranged for you just as easily as it was for your mother." That evening, Alexander sat in his chambers writing out everything he had learned, creating multiple copies of the evidence to ensure it couldn't all be destroyed if something happened to him. As he worked, he kept thinking about his mother's courage in investigating the conspiracy despite the obvious danger. A soft knock at his door made him quickly hide his papers. "Come in," he called. To his surprise, it was his father who entered, looking more serious than Alexander had seen him in years. "Son, I need to talk with you about something important," King Marcus said, settling into his usual chair. "Lord Reginald has expressed some concerns about your recent behavior. He says you've been exploring parts of the castle that have been sealed off, asking unusual questions about your mother." Alexander's heart sank. Lord Reginald was already moving against him, using his father to control his activities. "I was just curious about my mother's old rooms, father." "Is that so wrong?" "Not wrong, but potentially dangerous," the king replied. "Those rooms were sealed because they contain painful memories for me. I don't like to think about the time when she was sick." Alexander studied his father's face carefully. King Marcus looked genuinely pained, but Alexander wondered how much his father actually knew about the circumstances of Queen Isabella's death. "Father, what if mother wasn't really sick? What if something else happened to her?" King Marcus's expression became guarded. "What do you mean by that? What if someone hurt her? What if her death wasn't natural?" The king was quiet for a long moment, and Alexander saw something in his father's eyes that might have been recognition, or fear, or both. "Alexander," King Marcus said finally, "there are some things in this world that are better left alone. Your mother's death was thoroughly investigated by the royal physicians. Sometimes we want to find complex explanations for things that are simply tragic coincidences." But Alexander caught something in his father's tone, a careful quality that reminded him of the way other people spoke when they were hiding something. "Did you ever suspect that something was wrong?" The king began, then stopped himself. "Lord Reginald has been my advisor for many years. He helped me through the darkest period of my life after your mother died. I trust his judgment about these matters." Alexander realized with growing horror that his father might already know or suspect the truth about Lord Reginald, but was too afraid or too dependent on the man to take action. The weight of responsibility settled even more heavily on Alexander's shoulders. If his father couldn't or wouldn't act, then it was up to him to expose the conspiracy and bring justice for his mother. "I understand, father," Alexander said carefully. "I won't disturb the sealed rooms anymore." After King Marcus left, Alexander sat in the darkness of his chamber, feeling more alone than ever before. He was 15 years old, and he was the only person who could save his kingdom from a conspiracy that had already claimed his mother's life. Tomorrow, he would have to begin the dangerous work of exposing the truth, knowing that Lord Reginald would be watching his every move. Alexander touched the hidden necklace beneath his shirt, drawing strength from his mother's courage. She had died trying to protect the kingdom she loved. Now it was his turn to finish what she had started, no matter what the cost might be. The next morning brought news that would change everything. Alexander woke to the sound of urgent voices in the corridor outside his chambers. When he opened his door, he found servants rushing back and forth with worried expressions. "What's happening?" he asked a passing maid. "It's the king, your highness," she said, her voice trembling. "He's fallen ill during the night. The physicians are with him now." Alexander's blood turned to ice. He dressed quickly and ran to his father's chambers, where he found Lord Reginald standing outside the door with several court physicians. The advisor's expression was appropriately concerned, but Alexander now knew to look beyond surface appearances. "How is he?" Alexander demanded. "The physicians are doing everything they can," Lord Reginald said smoothly. "Your father complained of stomach pains during the night, followed by fever and weakness. It came on quite suddenly. Alexander stared at the man who had murdered his mother and was now apparently trying to kill his father. The timing was too convenient to be coincidence. Lord Reginald had probably decided that King Marcus was becoming suspicious or unreliable.
May I see him? Alexander asked.
The physicians have requested no visitors while they work, Lord Reginald replied. But don't worry, Your Highness. I'm sure your father will recover soon. In the meantime, as senior advisor, I'll handle the kingdom's urgent business to ensure everything runs smoothly. The way Lord Reginald said those words made Alexander's skin crawl. The man was already positioning himself to take control while the king was incapacitated. If King Marcus died, Lord Reginald would essentially rule the kingdom as regent until Alexander came of age. Alexander excused himself and went immediately to find Sir Thomas. He found the master of arms in the armory, sharpening weapons with unusual intensity.
You've heard about the king? Alexander asked.
Aye, Sir Thomas said grimly.
Sudden illness, they say. Just like your mother. We have to do something. If my father dies, Lord Reginald will control everything. Sir Thomas set down his whetstone and looked at Alexander seriously. I've been thinking about that all morning. We need to move faster than we planned. How much evidence do you actually have?
Alexander told him about all the documents he had found, both in his mother's study and in the bell tower. But most of it is still hidden.
We'd need time to gather everything and present it properly. Time we may not have, Sir Thomas said. If your father dies, Lord Reginald becomes regent.
He could have us both arrested on trumped-up charges before we ever get a chance to expose him.
Then, what do you suggest? Sir Thomas was quiet for a moment, thinking hard. There's one person who might be able to help us, but it's risky.
Lady Margaret, the king's sister. She has no love for Lord Reginald, and she has influence with the other noble families.
Alexander remembered his Aunt Margaret well.
She was a sharp, intelligent woman who had never married and instead devoted herself to managing her own estates. She had always been kind to him, but she also had a reputation for being fiercely protective of the royal family's interests.
Do you think she would believe us? If we present the evidence properly, yes.
But we'd have to be very careful about how we approach her. Lord Reginald has eyes and ears everywhere in this castle. They decided that Alexander would visit his aunt that afternoon, ostensibly to seek comfort during his father's illness. Sir Thomas would use that time to quietly alert trusted members of the guard about potential threats to the royal family. Lady Margaret's estates were only an hour's ride from the castle. Alexander told Lord Reginald that he needed fresh air and time to think, and, surprisingly, the advisor didn't object to the trip. Perhaps he thought it would be easier to eliminate Alexander once he was away from the castle's protective walls. Alexander took only 2 guards with him, men that Sir Thomas had personally recommended as completely trustworthy. As they rode through the countryside, Alexander kept checking behind them to see if they were being followed. He didn't see anyone, but that didn't mean they weren't there. Lady Margaret's manor house was smaller than the royal castle but beautifully maintained. She met Alexander at the door herself, her face showing immediate concern.
Alexander, dear boy, she said, embracing him warmly. I just heard about your father's illness. How is he? That's what I need to talk to you about, Aunt Margaret. But, not here. Is there somewhere private we can speak?
Lady Margaret's sharp eyes caught something in his tone that suggested this wasn't a simple family visit.
Of course. Come to my private study.
Once they were alone, Alexander made the same difficult decision he had made with Sir Thomas. He told his aunt everything, starting with finding his mother's journal and ending with his father's sudden illness. Lady Margaret listened in silence, her expression growing more serious with each revelation. When Alexander finished, she sat back in her chair and studied his face carefully. These are very serious accusations, she said finally.
Do you understand what you're suggesting?
If you're wrong about Lord Reginald, you could be committing treason.
I'm not wrong, Alexander said firmly. I have proof. Then, show me.
Alexander had brought some of the documents with him, hidden in his saddlebags. He spread them out on Lady Margaret's desk and watched as she read through them with growing anger.
That snake, she muttered as she read Lord Blackwood's letters.
I never trusted that family, but I had no idea they were this ambitious.
She looked up at Alexander with new respect.
Your mother was braver than I gave her credit for. And you're showing the same courage by coming to me with this.
Will you help us?
Lady Margaret stood and began pacing around the room.
This conspiracy involves several of the most powerful families in the kingdom. Even with this evidence, it won't be easy to move against them.
They have allies, resources, and influence that could make them very dangerous if they feel cornered.
What do you think we should do?
First, we need to make sure your father survives whatever Lord Reginald has done to him. I have contacts among the royal physicians, good men who are loyal to the crown. I'll send my own physician to the castle immediately with instructions to watch for signs of poisoning.
And, then? Then, we gather allies.
There are noble families who have remained loyal to your father, people who would be outraged to learn about this conspiracy. But, we need to move carefully. If word gets back to Lord Reginald that we're organizing against him, he might take desperate action. Lady Margaret wrote several urgent letters while Alexander waited. She dispatched trusted messengers to key allies throughout the kingdom, calling them to an emergency meeting under the pretense of consulting about the king's illness. It will take 2 days for most of them to arrive, she said. In the meantime, you need to return to the castle and act as if nothing has changed.
Can you do that? I think so, Alexander said, though he wasn't entirely sure.
The idea of facing Lord Reginald and pretending everything was normal seemed almost impossible. Be very careful, Lady Margaret warned. If Lord Reginald suspects that you know the truth, your life will be in immediate danger. Don't take any food or drink that he might have access to, and stay close to Sir Thomas and the guards you trust.
The ride back to the castle felt longer than the trip out. Alexander kept rehearsing what he would say if Lord Reginald asked about his visit to Lady Margaret.
He decided to stick as close to the truth as possible. He was upset about his father's illness and had sought comfort from family. When Alexander arrived at the castle, he was relieved to find that his father's condition had stabilized. The royal physicians reported that the king was conscious and asking for his son. Alexander hurried to his father's chambers, where he found King Marcus looking pale and weak but alert. Lord Reginald was there, of course, hovering near the bed like a concerned friend.
Alexander, the king said weakly. I'm glad you're back.
I was worried when Lord Reginald told me you had ridden out alone. I went to see Aunt Margaret, Alexander said, watching Lord Reginald's reaction carefully. I needed to talk to someone about how worried I was about you. How thoughtful, Lord Reginald said, but Alexander caught a slight tightening around the man's eyes.
I trust Lady Margaret as well. She's very concerned about father's condition.
She's sending her own physician to help with his care.
This time Lord Reginald's reaction was more obvious.
He clearly didn't like the idea of an outside physician examining the king. I'm sure that won't be necessary.
Our royal physicians are quite capable. More help can't hurt, Alexander said innocently.
Aunt Margaret's physician is supposed to be very skilled with mysterious illnesses. King Marcus looked confused by this exchange, but he was too weak to ask many questions. Alexander spent some time talking with his father about trivial matters, all while watching Lord Reginald from the corner of his eye.
When Alexander finally left his father's chambers, Lord Reginald followed him into the corridor.
Your Highness, the advisor said in a low voice. I hope you understand that during this difficult time, it's important for the royal family to present a united front.
Involving outside parties in the king's medical care could send the wrong message to our enemies. Alexander met the man's gaze steadily.
I only want what's best for my father's health. I'm sure you understand that.
Of course, Lord Reginald replied, but his smile didn't reach his eyes.
I just want to make sure you don't do anything rash during this emotional time. Grief can sometimes make people act in ways they later regret. The threat was clear. Lord Reginald was warning him to be careful about his actions.
Alexander nodded as if he understood only the surface meaning of the words.
Thank you for your concern, Lord Reginald.
I'll be very careful about everything I do.
That evening, Lady Margaret's physician arrived at the castle. Dr. Edmund was an elderly man with kind eyes and gentle hands. He examined the king thoroughly while Lord Reginald watched with obvious displeasure.
After his examination, Dr. Edmund requested a private word with Alexander.
They met in the castle's chapel, where the old physician confirmed Alexander's worst fears.
Your father is being poisoned, Dr. Edmund said quietly.
It's a slow-acting toxin, probably being administered in small doses over several days. The symptoms match a particular plant extract that causes gradual organ failure.
Can you save him?
I believe so, if we act quickly. But first we need to identify how the poison is being delivered.
Is there anything your father eats or drinks regularly that others don't share? Alexander thought carefully.
His father had a particular tea blend that Lord Reginald always prepared for him personally, claiming it helped with digestion. The king usually drank it twice a day, morning and evening.
His evening tea, Alexander said.
Lord Reginald always prepares it himself.
Dr. Edmund nodded grimly. That's likely our answer.
I'll need to test it, but I'll have to be very careful about how I do it. If Lord Reginald realizes we've discovered his method, he might change to something faster acting.
How long does my father have? If the poisoning continues at its current rate, perhaps a week.
But now that I know what we're dealing with, I can give him treatments that will slow the toxin's effects and help his body fight it off. Alexander felt a mixture of relief and terror. His father might survive, but they were running out of time to expose the conspiracy before Lord Reginald took more drastic action. The next morning brought the first of Lady Margaret's allies. Lord Harrison arrived with a small retinue, officially coming to pay his respects to the sick king. But Alexander knew his real purpose was to attend the secret meeting Lady Margaret was organizing. Throughout the day, more noble families arrived at the castle. Lord Reginald seemed pleased by this show of support for the royal family, not realizing that these same nobles were gathering to discuss his destruction. That evening, while Lord Reginald was occupied with hosting the visiting nobles at dinner, Alexander slipped away to meet with Lady Margaret and their allies in a small chapel outside the castle grounds. The group included some of the most powerful and respected families in the kingdom. Lady Margaret had shared the evidence with them beforehand, so they were already aware of the basic facts. But seeing Alexander present the proof in person, hearing him tell the story of discovering his mother's murder, made the reality of the situation hit home for all of them. "This is monstrous," declared Lord Harrison, a gruff old soldier who had fought alongside King Marcus in his youth. "To think that Snake has been plotting against the crown for years while pretending to be a loyal advisor. The question now is how to proceed," said Lady Catherine, one of the few female nobles with significant political power.
"We can't simply arrest Lord Reginald without proper legal proceedings, but we also can't let this conspiracy continue."
"I say we present the evidence to the king directly," suggested Lord Harrison. "Marcus deserves to know the truth about his wife's death, even if it's painful." "The king is still too weak from the poisoning," Lady Margaret objected. "Such shocking news could kill him in his current condition." They debated various approaches for over an hour before Alexander finally spoke up.
"What if we forced Lord Reginald to confess publicly?
If we could trick him into revealing his crimes in front of witnesses, it would be impossible for him to deny them later." The adults looked at him with surprise. Lady Catherine was the first to respond.
"That's actually not a bad idea. But how would we manage such a thing?"
Alexander had been thinking about this during their discussion.
"Lord Reginald believes he's won.
He thinks my father is dying and that he'll soon control the kingdom through me.
What if we let him believe his plan is working, then spring a trap when he's feeling most confident?"
Lady Margaret smiled with pride at her nephew's cleverness.
"What did you have in mind?"
"Tomorrow night, there's supposed to be a formal dinner for all the visiting nobles.
What if we arranged for Lord Reginald to think my father had taken a turn for the worse?
He might be tempted to reveal his true intentions, especially if he thought no one could stop him anymore." The plan they developed was risky, but it was their best chance to expose Lord Reginald without giving him time to escape or destroy evidence. Dr. Edmund would make it appear that the king's condition had worsened dramatically, while the loyal nobles would position themselves to witness and record whatever Lord Reginald revealed. As Alexander made his way back to the castle that night, he thought about how different his life had become in just a few days. A week ago, his biggest concern had been learning proper diplomatic protocol. Now he was orchestrating a plan to expose a murderous conspiracy that threatened his entire family. But, as he touched his mother's necklace beneath his shirt, Alexander felt a sense of purpose that gave him strength. Tomorrow night, he would finally get justice for Queen Isabella, and Lord Reginald would pay for his crimes. The only question was whether they could pull off their dangerous plan without getting themselves killed in the process. The day of the formal dinner dawned gray and stormy, as if the weather itself reflected the tension building within the castle walls. Alexander woke early and spent the morning going over their plan one final time with Lady Margaret and Sir Thomas. Every detail had to be perfect, because they would only get one chance. Dr. Edmund had worked through the night to prepare everything needed to make the king's condition appear worse than it actually was. Using harmless herbs and careful makeup, he could simulate the appearance of someone near death while keeping King Marcus safe and alert enough to witness what would happen. Remember, Lady Margaret warned Alexander as they made final preparations, "You must act completely natural around Lord Reginald today. If he suspects anything, he might flee before tonight's dinner."
Alexander nodded, though his stomach was twisted with nervousness.
He had been practicing his reactions in front of a mirror, trying to look like a grieving son who was about to lose his father rather than someone planning to expose a murderer.
The visiting nobles spent the day conducting normal court business, giving no sign that they knew about the conspiracy.
Lord Reginald seemed pleased with their presence, apparently viewing it as validation of his position as the king's most trusted advisor.
Around midday, Dr. Edmund made his move.
He emerged from the king's chambers with a grave expression and requested an immediate meeting with Lord Reginald and Alexander.
They gathered in a small antechamber near the royal quarters.
"I'm afraid I have troubling news," Dr. Edmund said, his voice heavy with false sorrow.
"The king's condition has deteriorated significantly during the night.
His organs are beginning to fail, and I fear we may lose him within hours." Alexander had rehearsed his reaction to this news, but he found that acting devastated wasn't difficult when he thought about how close his father had actually come to death. "No," he said, his voice cracking with genuine emotion.
"There must be something you can do."
"I'm doing everything possible, Your Highness, but we must prepare for the worst. Perhaps it would be wise to cancel tonight's dinner and inform the noble families that they should prepare for a period of mourning."
Lord Reginald's expression showed appropriate concern, but Alexander caught a brief flash of something else in the man's eyes. Satisfaction.
Lord Reginald was pleased that the king was apparently dying right on schedule. "No," Lord Reginald said thoughtfully. "The dinner should proceed as planned.
In times of crisis, it's important to show that the kingdom remains stable.
The visiting nobles need to see that we can maintain proper protocols even during difficult circumstances." Alexander understood the real reason Lord Reginald wanted the dinner to continue. It would give him an opportunity to address all the powerful nobles at once, positioning himself as the natural leader during the transition period. "But surely we should postpone any celebrations while my father is dying," Alexander protested, playing his role perfectly.
"It's not a celebration, Your Highness," Lord Reginald said smoothly.
"It's a formal gathering to discuss the kingdom's future during these uncertain times. Your presence will be particularly important, as the nobles will need to see that the royal line continues strong despite this tragedy."
The way he said "royal line continues" made Alexander's skin crawl.
Lord Reginald was already thinking about controlling him as a puppet king after his father's death. That afternoon, Alexander visited his father's chambers, where King Marcus was playing his part in their deception. Dr. Edmund had used makeup and lighting to make the king appear much sicker than he actually was.
When Alexander entered the room, his father looked genuinely near death. "Father," Alexander said, taking the king's hand.
In a whisper too low for any potential listeners, he added, "Tonight we'll get justice for Mother." King Marcus squeezed his son's hand weakly. Dr. Edmund had explained everything to the king that morning, and, despite his weakened condition from the real poisoning, Marcus was determined to see Lord Reginald exposed. Learning the truth about his wife's murder had filled him with a cold fury that gave him strength. "Be careful tonight," the king whispered back. "Lord Reginald is more dangerous than we ever imagined." As evening approached, the great hall was prepared for the formal dinner. The visiting nobles took their seats according to protocol, but Alexander noticed they had positioned themselves strategically around the room. If Lord Reginald tried to flee when confronted, they would be able to block his escape routes. Sir Thomas had also quietly positioned trusted guards at key locations throughout the castle. They had been told only that there might be a security threat during dinner, not the full details of the conspiracy. Lord Reginald arrived dressed in his finest robes, looking every inch the distinguished royal advisor. He took his customary seat at the king's right hand, though the king's chair remained empty due to his supposed condition. "My lords and ladies," Lord Reginald began when everyone was seated, "we gather tonight during one of the most difficult periods in our kingdom's recent history. As you know, His Majesty's condition has taken a turn for the worse, and we must prepare ourselves for the possibility that we may soon be without our beloved king." A murmur of appropriate concern went around the table. Alexander sat in his father's chair, trying to look like a young man overwhelmed by impending responsibility. During these uncertain times, Lord Reginald continued, it becomes more important than ever to ensure stability and continuity in our government.
Prince Alexander is still young, and the burdens of kingship are enormous.
As senior advisor to the crown, I believe it would be wise to establish a council of regency to guide the kingdom until His Highness comes of age. Several of the nobles exchanged meaningful glances. This was exactly what they had expected Lord Reginald to propose, a way to seize control while appearing to act in the kingdom's best interests. Lord Harrison leaned forward in his chair. That's a significant constitutional change, Lord Reginald.
What authority would such a council have? Complete authority over all matters of state, naturally, Lord Reginald replied.
The prince would remain as the symbolic head of the royal family, but all actual governance would be handled by experienced advisors who understand the complexities of ruling a kingdom.
Lady Catherine spoke up next. And who would lead this council of regency?
Lord Reginald's smile was modest, but his eyes gleamed with ambition. I would humbly accept that responsibility if called upon to serve. After all, I have advised the crown faithfully for many years and have intimate knowledge of all current policies and procedures.
This was the moment Alexander had been waiting for.
That's very generous of you, Lord Reginald, he said, his voice carrying a tremor that could be interpreted as either emotion or nervousness.
But, I have to ask, how do I know I can trust you completely? Lord Reginald's expression showed surprise at the question. Your Highness, I've served your family loyally for decades.
I was your father's closest friend and advisor. Yes, you were very close to both my parents, Alexander agreed.
Close enough to know all their secrets. Something in Alexander's tone must have alerted Lord Reginald that this conversation was heading in an unexpected direction.
The older man's eyes narrowed slightly.
I'm not sure what you're implying, Your Highness.
Alexander reached into his jacket and pulled out one of the documents he had found in his mother's hiding place. I'm implying that you murdered my mother, and you've been slowly poisoning my father. The great hall fell completely silent. Several nobles gasped audibly, while others leaned forward to better hear what was happening. Lord Reginald's face went pale, but he quickly recovered his composure. Your Highness, grief can sometimes cause people to imagine things that aren't real. Perhaps you should rest and let the adults handle these serious matters.
Should I rest like my mother rested?
Alexander asked, his voice growing stronger.
After you gave her poison to cure her mysterious illness? That's enough, Lord Reginald said sharply, standing up from his chair. You're obviously distraught about your father's condition.
Guards, please escort His Highness to his chambers. But, instead of royal guards responding to his call, Sir Thomas and several loyal soldiers stepped out from behind pillars where they had been hidden. At the same time, the noble families around the table stood up, their hands resting on their sword hilts. I don't think Prince Alexander is going anywhere, Sir Thomas said grimly.
In fact, I think you're the one who needs to be escorted somewhere, straight to the dungeons.
Lord Reginald looked around the room and realized he was completely surrounded. His carefully constructed world was collapsing around him, but he wasn't finished fighting yet. You have no proof of these ridiculous accusations, he said, his voice rising.
The word of a grieving boy against my decades of faithful service? No court would convict me based on such flimsy evidence. What about this evidence? Alexander asked, spreading more documents across the table.
Letters between you and Lord Blackwood discussing my mother's murder.
Financial records showing how you've been stealing from the royal treasury.
Written proof of your plans to overthrow my father and seize control of the kingdom. As the nobles examined the documents, their expressions grew increasingly angry. Lord Harrison was the first to speak. These letters are in your handwriting, Reginald. Your own words condemning you as a traitor and a murderer.
Lord Reginald's composure finally cracked completely.
You fools, he snarled. You have no idea what you're destroying.
This kingdom needs strong leadership, not the weakness Marcus represents.
I've been protecting all of you from his poor decisions for years.
By murdering his wife and slowly killing him? Lady Catherine asked incredulously. Isabella was going to destroy everything with her naive investigation.
She would have exposed necessary arrangements that keep this kingdom stable. Sometimes sacrifice is required for the greater good.
Alexander felt rage building inside him as he listened to Lord Reginald justify his mother's murder. The greater good? Or your personal ambition? What would you know about ruling a kingdom? Lord Reginald shot back. "You're just a child playing at being a prince. I've been the real power behind the throne for years, making the difficult decisions your father was too weak to make." "Then, you admit it," Sir Thomas said, stepping closer. "You admit to murdering Queen Isabella and poisoning King Marcus." Lord Reginald seemed to realize he had said too much, but it was far too late. "I admit to doing what was necessary to protect this kingdom from bad leadership." "Guards," Lady Margaret called out, "arrest this man for high treason and murder." As Sir Thomas's soldiers moved to apprehend him, Lord Reginald made one final desperate move. He pulled a hidden dagger from his robes and lunged toward Alexander. "If I can't rule through you, then the royal line ends tonight," he screamed. But Sir Thomas was ready for such a move. The old soldier intercepted Lord Reginald's attack, his own sword flashing in the candlelight. There was a brief struggle, and then Lord Reginald collapsed to the floor, Sir Thomas's blade piercing his heart. "It's finished," Sir Thomas said grimly, looking down at the body of the man who had betrayed the crown for so many years. Alexander stared at Lord Reginald's lifeless form, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been done, but it couldn't bring back his mother or undo the years of deception and betrayal. "The king," Lady Margaret said urgently. "We need to tell him that it's over." They rushed to King Marcus's chambers, where Dr. Edmund was maintaining the pretense of the king being near death. When they burst through the doors with news of Lord Reginald's confession and death, the king sat up in bed despite his weakness. "Is it true?" he asked. "Did he really confess to killing Isabella?" "He did, father," Alexander said, sitting beside the bed and taking his father's hand. "And Dr. Edmund has been treating you for the poison Lord Reginald was giving you. You're going to recover." King Marcus closed his eyes and tears ran down his cheeks. 10 years, he whispered. 10 years I trusted the man who murdered my wife. But now we know the truth, Alexander said gently. And Mother's sacrifice wasn't in vain. Her investigation led us to expose the entire conspiracy. Over the following days, the full extent of the plot was revealed. Lord Blackwood and several other conspirators were arrested and put on trial. The stolen money was returned to the royal treasury, and new safeguards were put in place to prevent similar corruption in the future. King Marcus recovered slowly from the poisoning, growing stronger each day as the toxins left his system. The experience had changed him, making him more cautious about whom he trusted but also more determined to rule justly in honor of his wife's memory. Alexander found that solving the mystery of his mother's death had changed him as well. He was no longer the innocent young prince who had stumbled upon secrets by accident. He had become someone who understood the complexities of power and the importance of fighting for justice even when it was dangerous. On a quiet evening 2 weeks after Lord Reginald's death, Alexander stood in his mother's garden wearing the sapphire necklace openly for the first time. King Marcus joined him there, still weak but determined to visit the place his wife had loved. "She would be proud of you," the king said, putting his arm around his son's shoulders. "You showed the same courage she did, the same determination to do what was right no matter the cost." "I wish I could have saved her too," Alexander replied. "You did save her, in a way," King Marcus said thoughtfully. "You made sure her death meant something. You finished what she started and brought justice for her sacrifice." As they stood together in the moonlit garden, Alexander touched the sapphire necklace and made a silent promise to his mother. He would be the kind of king she would have wanted, honest, just, and willing to fight for truth even when others preferred comfortable lies. The conspiracy that had claimed Queen Isabella's life was finally ended, but Alexander knew his real work was just beginning. Someday he would rule this kingdom, and when he did, he would make sure that no one could ever again use murder and betrayal to seize power from the rightful crown. The hidden truth had been revealed at last, and with it came both justice for the past and hope for the future. Alexander was no longer just a prince learning to rule, he was a young man who had proven himself worthy of the crown he would someday wear, and the kingdom his mother had died protecting.